There I was, 73 years old, sitting in a cold marble lobby at 4 in the morning, wearing yesterday's clothes and clutching a purse that held more money than most people see in a lifetime. The concierge kept glancing at me with those pitying eyes, the kind reserved for abandoned pets and forgotten elderly relatives. But here's what he didn't know. What none of them knew. I wasn't the victim in this story. I was about to become the architect of the most expensive lesson my family would ever receive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special. For you! You see, when you've lived as long as I have, when you've buried a husband, built a fortune, and raised children who see dollar signs instead of laugh lines when they look at your face, you learn that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop giving. And that night, abandoned in that hotel lobby like a piece of luggage nobody wanted to claim, I didn't just stop giving my money. I stopped giving a damn. My name is Laura Butler, and if you saw me walking down the street, you'd probably see what everyone else sees. A well-dressed older woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat chignon, sensible shoes that cost more than most people's rent, and the kind of jewelry that whispers wealth rather than screaming it. What you wouldn't see is the girl from rural Tennessee, who married young, worked double shifts at the diner while her husband built his construction business from nothing, who invested every spare penny and turned a modest inheritance into an empire worth $47 million. I suppose that's where this story really begins. Not in that hotel lobby, but 45 years ago when my beloved Thomas passed away suddenly from a heart attack, leaving me with 3 young children and a business I barely understood. Everyone expected me to sell, to take whatever I could get, and fade quietly into widowhood. Instead, I rolled up my sleeves, learned everything there was to know about commercial real estate, and turned Butler Holdings into one of the most successful property management companies in the Southeast. The children, my children, were 8, 10, and 12 when their father died. Michael, Sarah, and David. They grew up watching me work 18-hour days, watching me sacrifice vacations and social events to ensure they never wanted for anything. Private schools, summer camps, college tuition paid in full, down payments on their first homes, seed money for their businesses. I told myself I was doing it for them, building something they could inherit, creating a legacy that would secure their futures long after I was gone. But somewhere along the way, my love became their expectation. My sacrifices became their entitlement. And my children became strangers who called me mom but treated me like a walking trust fund. It had been 5 years since we'd all been together in one place. 5 years of missed birthdays, canceled holiday plans, and conversations that lasted exactly long enough for them to ask if I was feeling well, mention their latest financial stress, and hang up with promises to call again soon. So when I decided to plan this family reunion vacation, I convinced myself it was exactly what we all needed. A chance to reconnect, to remember what we meant to each other beyond the quarterly dividend checks. I spared no expense, naturally. The grand seaside resort in Hilton Head, oceanfront suites for everyone, the presidential villa for me, a week of activities planned and paid for in advance, deep-sea fishing for the men, spa days for the women, a private beach barbecue, golf, lessons for the grandchildren. I covered flights, meals, even spending money so no one had to worry about costs. The total came to just over $38,000. But what's money when you're buying time with the people you love most in the world? The resort was everything the brochures promised and more. Pristine white beaches stretched as far as the eye could see, palm trees swayed in the ocean breeze, and our accommodations were nothing short of palatial. My villa alone had 4 bedrooms, a full kitchen, a private pool, and a wraparound deck that offered stunning sunrise views over the Atlantic. I had imagined mornings spent drinking coffee on that deck with my children, sharing memories and making new ones. Michael arrived first with his wife Jennifer and their twin boys, ages 15. He'd inherited his father's broad shoulders and, Steady hands, but somewhere along the way he'd also acquired a permanent crease between his eyebrows and a tendency to check his phone every few minutes. His commercial contracting business was thriving, but you'd never know it from the way he complained about labor costs and material shortages over dinner. "The margins are getting tighter every year, Mom," he said, cutting into his prime rib without looking up. "Sometimes I wonder if it's even worth the stress anymore." I nodded sympathetically, though we both knew his company had netted over $2 million the previous year. "Perhaps it's time to consider expanding into residential work," I suggested. "The housing market is still strong." "That would require significant capital investment," Jennifer chimed in, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her wine glass. "New equipment, additional staff, more insurance coverage." The conversation followed a familiar pattern, circling inevitably around the challenges of growing a business, the risks of taking on debt, the wisdom of having a substantial cash reserve. I'd heard variations of this same discussion countless times over the years, always ending with meaningful looks and heavy sighs that suggested solutions just beyond their reach. Sarah arrived the next day with her husband Mark and their daughter Sophia, who was 17 and spent most of her time taking selfies by the pool. Sarah had always been my most artistic child, the dreamer who wanted to open an art gallery someday. She'd gotten her master's degree in art history, worked at several museums, and talked endlessly about her vision for a space that would showcase emerging artists from the Southeast. "There's this perfect building in downtown Charleston," she told me over lunch, her eyes lighting up with the same enthusiasm she'd had as a child when she talked about becoming a famous painter. "It's been empty for 2 years, and the owner is motivated to sell. The location is incredible, right in the Arts District, with enough space for exhibitions, workshops, maybe even artist studios upstairs." "It sounds wonderful, dear," I said, genuinely pleased to see her passionate about something again. "Have you put together a business plan?" "Oh, yes. We've done all the research. Market analysis, projected revenues, operating costs, everything. Mark's been helping with the financial projections." She glanced at her husband, who nodded encouragingly. "The only thing we're missing is the initial investment. The asking price is reasonable, but with renovation costs and operating capital for the first 2 years, we'd need about $800,000 to do it right." David was the last to arrive, flying in from Atlanta with his second wife, Patricia, and her teenage son from her first marriage. At 35, David was the baby of the family, though his receding hairline and the soft paunch that came from too many business lunches made him look older than his years. He worked in finance, managed investment portfolios for wealthy clients, and had a habit of speaking in acronyms that made every conversation sound like a board meeting. "The Q2 numbers were solid, but we're seeing some headwinds in the tech sector," he explained over cocktails on our second evening. "My clients are looking to diversify, maybe move some assets into real estate or commodities. The volatility in the equity markets has everyone nervous." I listened politely, though I'd stopped trying to follow his explanations years ago. What I did understand was that his own portfolio had taken some hits recently, that his new house in Buckhead came with a mortgage that made him nervous, and that Patricia's son would be starting college soon, with no savings set aside for tuition. The first few days were pleasant enough if you overlooked the underlying tensions. The grandchildren seemed to enjoy the beach and the resort activities, though they spent most of their time on their phones or earbuds existing in their own digital worlds. The adults made efforts at conversation, but every discussion seemed to circle back to money. The cost of healthcare, the challenges of saving for retirement, the burden of college expenses, the risks and rewards of various investments. I found myself wondering when my family had become a collection of people who gathered only to discuss their financial anxieties in my presence. When had dinners together become informal pitch meetings? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When had, "How are you, Mom?" become shorthand for, "Are you planning to help us with our latest crisis?" But I pushed those thoughts away, determined to focus on the positive. We were together, all of us under one roof for the first time in years. There were moments of genuine warmth, watching Michael teach his sons to surf, seeing Sarah's face light up when she discovered a local artist's work in the hotel gift shop, listening to David and Patricia laugh together over some private joke. These were my children, my grandchildren, my family. Surely the love we shared was stronger than any financial complications. On the fourth day, I suggested we take a family photo on the beach at sunset. It seemed important to capture this moment, this rare gathering of the Butler clan. We arranged ourselves on the sand, 3 generations linked by shared history and, I hoped, shared affection. The photographer took dozens of shots, formal poses and candid moments, group shots and smaller combinations. Looking at those photos later, printed, immediately at the resort's business center, I could see what others might miss. The genuine smiles were reserved for the grandchildren's photos. In the adult group shots, the smiles were polite, practiced, the kind you give to acquaintances at charity functions. Michael's hand on my shoulder felt dutiful rather than affectionate. Sarah's arm around my waist was positioned carefully to avoid wrinkling her dress. David stood slightly apart, as if ready to step out of the frame at any moment. But I told myself I was being overly sensitive, reading too much into fleeting expressions and unconscious body language. This was my family, and we were making memories that would last long after I was gone. The turning point came on our 5th evening together. I'd arranged for a private dinner in one of the resort's smaller dining rooms, a more intimate setting than the main restaurant where we'd been eating most of our meals. The room overlooked the ocean, with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the sunset perfectly. Candles flickered on the table, and the staff had decorated with white roses, my favorite flower. I'd dressed carefully for the occasion, wearing a midnight blue dress that Thomas had always said brought out my eyes, along with the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 20th anniversary. I wanted this evening to be special, a celebration of family that would set the tone for the rest of our time together. As we settled into our seats, I cleared my throat gently. "I want to thank you all for being here," I began, looking around the table at these faces I loved so deeply. "It means more to me than you know to have everyone together like this. Your father would have been so proud to see the family we've become." There were murmurs of agreement, though I noticed several people were already checking their phones. Despite the formal setting, I continued, determined to make my point. "I know we all lead busy lives, and it's not always easy to make time for family. But moments like this remind me of what's truly important." Michael nodded absently while scrolling through his emails. "It's been great, Mom. Really relaxing. We should do this more often." "I'd love that," I said, and I meant it. "Perhaps we could make it an annual tradition. Same time next year, maybe try a different location." "I was thinking about that resort in the Caribbean you mentioned, Sarah, or maybe something in Europe. Tuscany could be beautiful in the spring." The enthusiasm in my voice must have been obvious, because suddenly I had everyone's attention. Phones were set aside, and all eyes were focused on me with an intensity I hadn't seen all week. "That sounds amazing," Sarah said quickly, "though next spring might be complicated with the gallery project. If everything goes according to plan, we'll be in the middle of renovations." "Assuming we can secure the financing," Mark added meaningfully. Jennifer leaned forward slightly. "Speaking of financing, we've been meaning to discuss something with you, Laura. Michael's been looking at this incredible opportunity to expand into the residential market, but the initial investment is substantial." "It's not just about the money," Michael interjected, though his eyes said otherwise. "It's about positioning the company for long-term growth. But you're right, the capital requirements are significant." David, not to be outdone, cleared his throat. "Since we're talking about investments, I should mention that Patricia and I have been researching college savings plans for Brandon. The costs are astronomical these days, and we want to make sure he has options. I sat there, listening to the conversation unfold around me, and suddenly understood what was happening. This wasn't a family dinner. It was a presentation, a carefully orchestrated pitch meeting where each of my children would make their case for a portion of my wealth. The sunset, the flowers, the elegant setting, it was all just staging for the main event. "Mom," Sarah said gently, "we know you've always been generous with us, and we don't take that for granted. But we're all at crucial points in our lives right now. Michael's expansion opportunity, my gallery dream, David's family planning, these are investments in our futures, in the family's future." The word investment hung in the air like expensive perfume, sweet but overwhelming. I looked around the table at these people I'd raised, these adults I'd supported and guided and loved unconditionally for decades. When had they stopped seeing me as their mother and started seeing me as their benefactor? "These are all wonderful projects," I said carefully, choosing my words with the precision of someone who'd spent years in business negotiations. "And I'm proud of your ambitions, all of you. But tonight is about being together as a family, not about business opportunities." The disappointment was subtle but unmistakable. Shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. Smiles became more forced. The energy in the room shifted, like air being let out of a balloon. Jennifer recovered first, her years of corporate PR experience serving her well. "Of course, you're absolutely right. This is family time. We can discuss business matters later." But the damage was done. The rest of the dinner proceeded with stilted conversation and awkward silences. The grandchildren, sensing the tension, became restless and started asking to be excused. By the time dessert arrived, half the table was empty, and those who remained seemed to be counting the minutes until they could politely escape. I excused myself early, claiming fatigue, and walked alone back to my villa. The ocean breeze felt cold against my face, and for the first time all week, I felt every one of my 73 years. Behind me, I could hear my family's voices carrying on the wind, animated now that I was gone, no doubt discussing strategies and next steps. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the evening I'd hoped for with the reality I'd experienced. I thought about Thomas, about the dreams we'd shared for our children, about the values we'd tried to instill. Had we failed somehow? Had our success, our wealth, our generosity created entitled adults who saw family gatherings as fundraising opportunities? Or was I being unfair? These were my children, after all. They'd come when I asked, spent a week away from their own responsibilities, smiled for photos and made conversation over long dinners. Maybe their financial concerns were legitimate, their requests reasonable. Maybe I was the one with unrealistic expectations, hoping for something that only existed in greeting card commercials and sentimental movies. The next morning brought our last full day together, and I was determined to end on a positive note. We had one final activity planned, a sunset cruise along the coast, complete with dinner and live music. I'd chartered a yacht that could accommodate our entire party comfortably, with plenty of space for the grandchildren to explore and adults to mingle or find quiet corners for conversation. The day started beautifully. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and gentle breezes. We spent the morning at the beach, the afternoon by the pool, and early evening getting ready for our cruise. I chose a white linen dress and matching jacket, something elegant but comfortable for an evening on the water. The yacht was everything I'd hoped for and more. Sleek and modern but with classic touches, it offered panoramic views of the coastline and luxurious amenities throughout. The crew was professional and welcoming, and the captain gave us a brief but entertaining overview of the local waters and wildlife we might spot during our journey. As we pulled away from the dock, I stood at the bow watching the resort grow smaller behind us, feeling a mix of nostalgia and anticipation. This was our last evening together, and I wanted to make it count. I wanted my family to remember this moment, this perfect setting, this feeling of being connected to something larger than our individual concerns. The cruise was magical in every sense of the word. We saw dolphins playing in our wake, pelicans diving for fish, and a sunset that painted the entire sky in shades of gold and crimson. The dinner was exceptional, the music was lovely, and for a few hours, it felt like we were the family I'd always imagined we could be. But as the evening wore on, I began to notice the same pattern I'd observed throughout the week. Conversations were polite but superficial. Laughter was genuine but brief. People gravitated toward their own nuclear families rather than mingling as one extended group. The grandchildren were more interested in their devices than the spectacular scenery around us. I found myself standing alone at the stern, watching our wake disappear into the darkening water when Sarah approached. She looked beautiful in the evening light, her dark hair whipping gently in the breeze, and for a moment she looked exactly like the little girl who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers. "It's been a wonderful week, Mom," she said, settling beside me at the rail. "Thank you for making this happen. I know it wasn't cheap, and I know you did it because you love us." "I do love you," I replied, meaning it completely. "All of you. More than you'll ever know." We stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the lights of the coast twinkle in the distance. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice careful and measured. "I've been thinking about what you said at dinner last night, about this being family time rather than business time. And you're right, of course. But I also think that sometimes business and family intersect in ways that can't be easily separated." I turned to look at her, recognizing the tone she'd inherited from me, the one I used when I was about to make an important point in a negotiation. "The gallery isn't just my dream, Mom. It's a legacy project, something that could benefit the whole family for generations. A cultural institution with the Butler name, something that contributes to the community and preserves Dad's memory in a meaningful way." She paused, letting that sink in, then continued. "And Michael's expansion isn't just about making more money. It's about securing jobs for dozens of families, contributing to the local economy, building something substantial that can be passed down to his boys." I listened without interrupting, admiring her approach even as I recognized the manipulation inherent in it. She was good at this, my daughter. She'd learned well from watching me work. Even David's situation with Brandon, that's about family too. About making sure the next generation has opportunities, that they're not burdened with debt or limited in their choices because of financial constraints. She turned to face me fully, her expression earnest and compelling. "What I'm trying to say is that when we talk about these projects, these investments, we're not just asking for handouts. We're talking about ways to extend your values, your vision, your impact into the future." It was a masterful presentation, and I told her, "So." She had the grace to blush slightly, but she didn't back down. "I learned from the best," she said with a small smile. "But I also meant every word. This isn't about greed, Mom. It's about legacy." We were interrupted by one of the crew members announcing that we'd be returning to port soon, and the moment passed. But Sarah's words stayed with me as we gathered our things and prepared to disembark. Legacy. The word carried weight, implied permanence and meaning beyond the immediate transaction. By the time we returned to the resort, it was nearly midnight. The grandchildren were tired and cranky, the adults were subdued from wine and sea air, and everyone was ready to call it a night. We made plans to meet for brunch the next morning before checkout, exchanged hugs and good nights, and went our separate ways. I was exhausted, but too wired to sleep immediately. I sat on my deck overlooking the ocean, replaying the events of the week, trying to make sense of my conflicted feelings. On one hand, I was grateful we'd had this time together. grateful for the memories we'd made and the connections we'd maintained. On the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was missing from our relationships. When had love become transactional? When had family time become an opportunity for financial planning? And most troubling of all, when had I become complicit in this arrangement by consistently providing the financial solutions to every problem my children presented? I fell asleep in the deck chair sometime around 3 a.m, wrapped in a blanket I'd grabbed from the couch, lulled by the sound of waves and the exhaustion of a week spent trying to be the matriarch everyone expected me to be. I woke to the sound of housekeeping carts rolling down the hallway and the distant hum of vacuum cleaners. The sun was already high, streaming through the glass doors of my deck, and I realized with a start that I'd slept outside all night. My neck was stiff from the awkward position in the chair, and my linen dress was wrinkled beyond repair. A quick glance at my watch showed it was already 10:30 a.m. Panic set in immediately. We were supposed to meet for brunch at 10, and checkout was at 11. I rushed inside, my joints protesting after hours in the uncomfortable deck chair, and quickly showered and changed into fresh clothes. My hands shook slightly as I applied my makeup, trying to cover the effects of too little sleep and too much emotional turmoil. I looked older than my 73 years, with new lines around my eyes and a pallor that no amount of foundation could completely hide. By the time I made it down to the restaurant, it was nearly 11:15. I expected to find my family waiting, perhaps worried about my absence, maybe even concerned about my well-being. Instead, I found an empty table with place settings that had clearly been used and cleared away. Crumpled napkins, coffee stains, and the faint aroma of bacon lingered as evidence of a meal that had proceeded without me. The hostess, a young woman with kind eyes and a sympathetic smile, approached as I stood there taking in the scene. "Mrs. Butler, your family asked me to give you this note. They said you'd know what it meant." With trembling fingers, I unfolded the piece of hotel stationery. Sarah's handwriting, always neat and precise, conveyed a message that was brief to the point of cruelty. "Mom, we waited as long as we could. Flights to catch, work tomorrow. Thank you for everything. Love you. Love you." 2 words that should have meant everything, but in this context felt like nothing more than a polite closing, the kind of phrase you'd use to end a letter to a distant relative or a casual acquaintance. I stood there in the empty restaurant, surrounded by the debris of a family meal I'd missed, holding a note that dismissed a week of my efforts with the casual efficiency of a business memo. The hostess was watching me with growing concern, probably wondering if I was going to cry or collapse or cause some sort of scene. I straightened my shoulders, summoned what dignity I could muster, and managed to speak in a voice that sounded almost normal. "Did they say anything else? About when they were leaving, or—" I trailed off, not sure what I was hoping to hear. "They mentioned they were checking out early to make their flights," she said gently. "But I think some of them are still upstairs packing. You might be able to catch them if you hurry." I thanked her and made my way to the elevators, my heels clicking against the marble floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet lobby. The ride to the 4th floor felt endless, each floor we passed marking another moment of growing dread. What would I say when I found them? How do you address being abandoned without sounding pathetic? How do you express hurt without seeming demanding? Michael's suite was my first stop. I knocked firmly, calling out his name, but got no response. The electronic lock showed red, indicating the room was no longer active. I tried Jennifer's name, then called out to the boys, but the silence was absolute. They were gone. Sarah's room was the same. I pressed my ear to the door, hoping to hear movement inside, voices, any sign of life. Nothing. David's suite was equally empty, the hallway eerily quiet except for the distant sound of housekeeping staff working in other sections of the hotel. I stood in that empty corridor, surrounded by doors that had closed without goodbyes, feeling more alone than I had since the day Thomas died. But unlike that day, when grief had been accompanied by an outpouring of love and support. This abandonment felt deliberate, calculated, efficient. They had literally packed up and left while I slept, avoiding the awkwardness of formal farewells or the inconvenience of waiting for their elderly mother to wake up. The elevator ride back to my own floor felt like a descent into something deeper than mere disappointment. I was experiencing a kind of awakening, a stripping away of illusions I'd maintained for years about the nature of my relationships with my children. They loved me, I had no doubt about that. But they loved me in the way you love a favorite restaurant or a reliable service provider, with appreciation for what I could do for them, not for who I was as a person. My villa felt cavernous and cold when I entered. The maid service had already been through, removing all traces of the family gathering that had filled these rooms just hours before. Fresh flowers replaced the wilted arrangements, clean towels hung in perfect symmetry, and the refrigerator had been restocked with items clearly intended for a single occupant. It was as if the past week had been erased, leaving no evidence that 3 generations of butlers had ever shared this space. I wandered from room to room, looking for something they might have left behind, a forgotten phone charger, a piece of clothing, anything that would require them to contact me. But they had been thorough in their departure, leaving nothing that would necessitate future communication unless they chose to initiate it. The silence was deafening. For a week, these rooms had been filled with voices, laughter, the sound of children splashing in the pool, the chatter of adults making plans. Now there was nothing but the whisper of air conditioning and the distant sound of waves that seemed less soothing than melancholy. I sat heavily on the couch where just last night I'd watched my grandchildren play video games, where I'd listened to my children discuss their dreams and aspirations, where I'd felt like the center of a loving family rather than the funding source for their various ambitions. The cushions still held the indentations from their bodies, but they felt cold and uninviting now, like furniture in a hotel lobby rather than a family gathering place. My phone remained stubbornly silent. No texts, no calls, no follow-up messages to explain the abrupt departure or to check on my well-being. I found myself staring at the screen, willing it to ring, hoping for some acknowledgement that leaving without a proper goodbye had been thoughtless rather than intentional. But as the minutes ticked by, the silence became its own message. Around 2 in the afternoon, I finally received a text from Michael. "Thanks again for an amazing week, Mom. Boys had a great time. Safe travels home." The message was followed by a generic emoji, a heart symbol that felt about as personal as a corporate holiday card. 20 minutes later, Sarah sent a similar message. "Beautiful resort, perfect weather, wonderful memories. Hope you enjoy your last day there." No mention of the missed breakfast, no explanation for the early departure, no suggestion that we might speak again soon. David's message arrived just before 3. "Great family time. Patricia and Brandon loved the beach. Thanks for your generosity as always." Again, that word. Generosity. As if the week had been a charitable donation rather than a grandmother's gift to her family. I studied those messages for a long time, parsing each word for hidden meaning or emotional subtext. What struck me most was their similarity, as if they'd been composed by committee or copied from a template. Professional, grateful, but utterly devoid of genuine warmth or personal connection. The afternoon stretched endlessly ahead of me. I was scheduled to fly out the next morning, which meant another 18 hours in this too-quiet villa, another night of sleeping alone in a space designed for family gatherings. The resort's activities continued around me, couples walking hand in hand on the beach, families playing in the pool, grandparents watching their grandchildren build sandcastles. But I felt disconnected from it all, like someone watching life through a window rather than participating in it. I decided to take a walk on the beach, hoping the ocean air might clear my head and provide some perspective on the morning's events. The sand was warm beneath my feet, and the breeze carried the familiar scent of salt and seaweed that had always been comforting to me. But even this simple pleasure felt muted now, filtered through the lens of my emotional state. Other families were scattered along the waterline, their voices carrying on the wind. I watched a grandfather teaching his grandson to skip stones, their heads bent together in concentration, their laughter genuine and unforced. 20 feet away, a grandmother was helping her granddaughter collect shells, pointing out the most beautiful specimens and sharing stories about similar treasures she'd found as a child. These scenes should have warmed my heart, but instead they highlighted what I'd been missing all week. None of my grandchildren had asked me to walk with them on the beach. None had sought out my company for shell collecting or storytelling or any of the countless small intimacies that build real relationships between generations. I thought about the twins, Michael's boys, who had spent most of the week absorbed in their phones or PlayStation. When they did interact with me, it was with the polite deference reserved for distant relatives or elderly neighbors. They called me grandmother, never grandma or nana, or any of the warmer variations I'd hoped to hear. They thanked me politely for gifts and activities, but there was no spontaneous affection, no special bond that transcended good manners. Sophia, Sarah's daughter, had been slightly more engaging, but even her interactions felt performative. She'd posed for selfies with me that I knew would end up on her social media accounts, but she'd never asked about my life, my experiences, my stories. I was a prop in her vacation narrative, not a person she was genuinely interested in knowing. Brandon, David's stepson, had barely acknowledged my existence. He was polite when directly addressed, but he'd never initiated a conversation or sought my company for any activity. I was funding his college education indirectly through my support of his stepfather, but he had no idea about the financial planning happening behind the scenes for his benefit. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my relationships with my grandchildren were essentially non-existent, beyond the superficial exchanges that occurred during our rare family gatherings. I was the lady who paid for vacations and sent generous birthday checks, but I wasn't someone they knew as a person or valued as a presence in their lives. As the sun began to set, I found myself walking back toward the resort with a growing sense of clarity. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate, but it was being joined by something else, a kind of analytical detachment that had served me well in business negotiations over the years. I was beginning to see my family dynamics with the same objectivity I'd once applied to investment decisions or property acquisitions. The facts were simple and undeniable. I had spent decades providing financial support to my children without requiring anything in return. Not gratitude, not affection, not even basic courtesy. They had learned to see me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. And I had enabled this dynamic by consistently meeting their financial needs without addressing the emotional cost to our relationships. Back in my villa, I sat on the deck with a glass of wine and watched the last light fade from the sky. The ocean was calm, reflecting the first stars like scattered diamonds on black velvet. It was beautiful, peaceful, the kind of evening that should have been shared with people you love. Instead, I was alone with my thoughts, and the growing realization that being alone might be preferable to being with people who saw you only as a means to an end. I thought about Thomas, about what he would have said if he could see how our family had evolved in the years since his death. He'd been a man of strong principles, someone who believed that love should be expressed through actions, not just words. But he'd also been someone who expected reciprocity in relationships, who believed that respect had to be mutual to be meaningful. "You're too generous for your own good, Laura," he'd often told me when I'd give in to one of the children's requests for help with some financial crisis or opportunity. "Sometimes the best thing you can do for people is let them solve their own problems." At the time, I dismissed his concerns as overly cautious. We had the money, our children had legitimate needs, and wasn't that what family was for? Helping each other through difficult times? But now I wondered if Thomas had seen something I'd missed. If his reluctance to provide constant financial assistance had been wisdom rather than stinginess. The wine was making me philosophical, but it was also clarifying my thinking in ways that surprised me. For the first time in years, I was able to separate my identity as a mother from my role as a benefactor. The two had become so intertwined that I'd forgotten there was a difference. I'd always prided myself on being a successful businesswoman, someone who made smart decisions based on careful analysis of risk and reward. But in my personal life, I'd been making the same mistake that bankrupted so many investors, throwing good money after bad, hoping that continued investment would eventually yield the returns I was seeking. The returns I was seeking weren't financial. Of course, they were emotional. I wanted my children to love me, to value my company, to include me in their lives because they enjoyed my presence, not because they needed my financial support. But instead of cutting off the money when it became clear that it wasn't buying genuine affection, I doubled down, convinced that the next gift, the next investment, the next generous gesture would finally bridge the gap between us. As I sat there in the darkness, I began to understand that I'd been conducting a failed experiment for decades. I'd been testing the hypothesis that generosity would create intimacy, that financial support would translate into emotional connection. The results were in, and they were unambiguous. My hypothesis had been wrong. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment my heart leaped with hope. Maybe one of them had realized how thoughtlessly they'd behaved. Maybe someone was calling to check on me, to apologize for the abrupt departure, to suggest that we extend our time together. Instead, it was a message from my property manager back home. Hope you're having a wonderful vacation. The Henderson property inspection went well, no major issues. See you next week. Even my employee was showing more consideration for my well-being than my own children had. The irony was not lost on me. I finished my wine and went inside to pack, though my flight wasn't until the next afternoon. The process felt mechanical, joyless, like cleaning up after a party that had ended badly. I folded clothes that had been chosen with such care for this family reunion, packed gifts that had been intended for people who'd left without saying goodbye, organized souvenirs that would now serve only as reminders of disappointment. But as I packed, I found myself making mental notes, observations that would have impressed my business partners with their clarity and objectivity. I was cataloging the week's events not as a wounded mother, but as an analyst studying a failed investment strategy. The emotional component was still there, but it was being balanced by a growing sense of practical assessment. I'd invested approximately $40,000 in this family reunion, including the resort costs, activities, meals, and incidental expenses. In return, I'd received a week of polite company from people who'd spent most of their time planning how to ask me for additional financial support. The return on investment had been negative by any measure. More significantly, I'd invested 45 years of maternal generosity, financial support, and emotional availability in relationships that had yielded diminishing returns over time. My children called me when they needed money, remembered my birthday when it was convenient, and included me in their lives when it served their purposes. By any business standard, these would be considered failed investments, worthy of divestiture rather than continued funding. The thought should have been devastating, but instead it felt liberating. For the first time in decades, I was seeing my family relationships clearly, without the distorting lens of hope or sentiment. And what I saw was a series of transactions masquerading as love, a collection of business arrangements disguised as family bonds. I slept better that night than I had all week, perhaps because I was finally alone with my thoughts rather than trying to be the version of myself that others expected. When I woke the next morning, I felt different. Not healed, but focused. I had decisions to make, and for the first time in years, I was prepared to make them based on logic rather than emotion. The hotel's business center was quiet when I arrived, just after breakfast. I had several hours before my flight, and I wanted to use the time productively. I'd built a successful business by making tough decisions based on careful analysis, and it was time to apply those same principles to my personal life. I started by making a list of every financial commitment I'd made to my children over the past 5 years. College funds for the grandchildren, business loans that had never been repaid, down payment assistance for homes, debt consolidation gifts, emergency medical expenses, vacation funding, and countless smaller amounts for everything, from car repairs to anniversary celebrations. The total was staggering, over $2 million in direct payments, plus another $1 million in gifts, travel expenses, and what I'd categorized as family investments. $3 million in 5 years, an average of $600,000 per year, all given with the expectation that it would strengthen our family bonds. Instead, it had created a dynamic where my children saw me as an ATM with a particularly generous withdrawal policy. They'd learned that every crisis could be solved with a call to mom, every opportunity could be funded with a request to mother, every financial stress could be alleviated with an appeal to grandmother's well-known generosity. I'd thought I was being a good parent, providing security and opportunities for my family. Instead, I'd been enabling a kind of emotional dependence that had stunted their growth as independent adults and reduced me to a role I'd never intended to play. The revelation was painful, but not surprising. Deep down, I'd known for years that something was wrong with these relationships. I'd just been too afraid to acknowledge it, too hopeful that the next gift would somehow fix what money had already broken. But sitting in that quiet business center, surrounded by the tools of commerce and negotiation, I felt the same clarity I'd experienced countless times when making difficult business decisions. The situation was clear, the options were limited, and sentiment had no place in the analysis. I had 3 choices. I could continue the current pattern, funding my children's lives while accepting that their affection was essentially purchased rather than genuine. I could gradually reduce my financial support while trying to rebuild our relationships on a more authentic foundation. Or I could make a clean break, withdrawing my financial support entirely and seeing what, if anything, remained of our connections without the monetary incentives. The first option was unacceptable. I'd been living it for years, and it had brought me to this moment of clarity in a hotel business center, cataloging the ways I'd been taken for granted by the people I loved most. The second option was appealing but probably unrealistic. My children had decades of conditioning to overcome. They'd learned to see me as a problem solver rather than a person, a resource rather than a relationship. Changing that dynamic gradually would require their cooperation and commitment, neither of which seemed likely given their behavior over the past week. The third option was the most radical, but also the most honest. If I removed the financial component from our relationships entirely, whatever remained would be genuine. If they continued to seek my company, call me regularly, include me in their lives, it would be because they valued me as a person rather than as a benefactor. And if they didn't? Well, at least I'd know where I stood. I spent the rest of the morning drafting letters to each of my children, trying to explain my decision in terms they would understand. The process was harder than any business negotiation I'd ever conducted, because the stakes were so much higher than money or property. I was essentially restructuring the most important relationships in my life, and there would be no going back once the letters were sent. But as I wrote, I felt a growing sense of peace. For the first time in years, I was being completely honest, with them and with myself. I was acknowledging that our current relationships were unsustainable, that my generosity had become a kind of emotional bribery, that their love had become conditional on my continued financial support. The hardest part was explaining that I still loved them, that this decision came from a desire to rebuild our relationships on a foundation of mutual respect rather than financial dependence. I wanted them to understand that I wasn't punishing them for their behavior, but rather trying to create space for genuine connection to develop. By the time I needed to leave for the airport, I had 3 sealed envelopes ready to mail. Each contained a letter explaining my decision, along with a certified check covering any immediate financial obligations I'd already committed to. After that, they would need to manage their own finances, make their own decisions, and relate to me as children to their mother rather than as beneficiaries to their patron. The flight home was turbulent, which seemed appropriate given the emotional storms I was navigating. But as we descended through the clouds toward the airport where I'd begun this journey a week earlier, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, anticipation for the future rather than regret about the past. I was 73 years old, wealthy beyond most people's dreams, and finally free to discover what my life could look like when it wasn't defined by other people's needs or expectations. The woman who had fallen asleep in that hotel lobby was gone, replaced by someone who understood the difference between being loved and being used, between being generous and being taken advantage of. The hardest lesson I'd ever learned had been taught by the people I loved most. But like all the best lessons, its value would only be measured by what I did with the knowledge I'd gained. The drive from the airport to my estate took 45 minutes through familiar countryside, past rolling hills dotted with horses and farmhouses that had stood for generations. Normally, this journey home filled me with satisfaction, a reminder of how far I'd traveled from that scared young widow who'd inherited a small construction business and a mountain of debt. But today, the landscape looked different somehow, less like a testament to my success and more like a beautiful prison I'd built around myself. My housekeeper, Maria, had been with me for 15 years. She greeted me at the front door with her usual warm smile, immediately taking my luggage and asking about the vacation. Her genuine concern for my well-being was such a stark contrast to my family's indifference that I found myself struggling to maintain composure. "How was the family reunion, Mrs. Butler? Did everyone enjoy the resort?" I managed what I hoped was a convincing smile. "It was lovely, Maria. Very relaxing. How have things been here?" She launched into a detailed report about the house's maintenance, the garden's progress, and various calls and deliveries that had arrived in my absence. Her efficiency and attention to detail reminded me why I valued her so highly. She cared about her work, took pride in her responsibilities, and treated me with consistent respect and kindness. As she spoke, I realized that Maria knew more about my daily life than my own children did. She remembered my preferences for morning coffee, noticed when I seemed tired or stressed, and often anticipated my needs before I voiced them. When had a paid employee become more attentive to my well-being than the people I'd raised from birth? My home office felt like a sanctuary after the emotional chaos of the past week. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the garden where Thomas and I had planned to spend our retirement years together. The mahogany desk where I'd made countless business decisions over the decades was exactly as I'd left it, with neat stacks of correspondence, financial reports, and investment portfolios awaiting my attention. I sat in the leather chair that had been Thomas's favorite, running my hands over the smooth surface of the desk, trying to center myself in the familiar surroundings. This room had witnessed some of my greatest triumphs: the acquisition of the downtown office complex that had tripled my net worth, the successful negotiation that had saved dozens of jobs during the recession, the charitable foundation establishment that had become my proudest legacy. But it had also been the setting for countless conversations with my children about their financial needs, their business plans, their various crises that required immediate maternal intervention. How many times had I sat in this very chair, writing checks to solve problems that weren't really mine to solve? The 3 sealed letters lay on the desk before me, addressed to Michael, Sarah, and David. I'd written them during those painful hours at the resort, but now, surrounded by the stability and luxury their contents would potentially jeopardize, I wondered if I was making a terrible mistake. These letters would change everything. Once mailed, there would be no pretending that our relationships were anything other than what they had become. The financial support that had defined my role as mother and grandmother for decades would end, and we would all have to navigate new territory without the familiar landmarks of monetary assistance. I thought about my grandchildren, about college, funds and future opportunities that might be affected by my decision. Was I being selfish, prioritizing my own emotional needs over their practical requirements? Was I punishing them for their parents' behavior? But then I remembered the twins' polite indifference, Sophia's performative affection, Brandon's complete disengagement. These children didn't know me as a person. They knew me as the lady who funded their vacations and sent expensive birthday gifts. Removing the financial component of our relationships might actually create space for something more authentic to develop. My attorney, Richard Cromwell, had been handling my legal affairs for over 20 years. When I called his office that afternoon, his secretary immediately put me through, recognizing the priority status I'd earned through decades of substantial legal fees and complex transactions. "Laura, welcome back. How was the family reunion?" Even Richard's polite inquiry felt more genuine than anything I'd received from my own children since returning home. I gave him a brief, carefully neutral summary of the vacation before explaining why I was calling. "I need to make some changes to my estate planning, Richard. Significant changes that will affect the current beneficiary arrangements." There was a pause, long enough for me to imagine him setting aside whatever he'd been working on to give me his full attention. Richard had shepherded me through some of the most important financial decisions of my life, and he understood the gravity such a statement represented. "Of course, Laura. Would you prefer to discuss this over the phone, or should we schedule a meeting?" "A meeting, I think. Tomorrow, if possible. And Richard, I'll need you to prepare documentation for some immediate changes as well. I want to establish new parameters for family financial support, effective immediately." Another pause, longer this time. Richard had met my children on numerous occasions, had helped structure their various business loans and investments, had witnessed firsthand the family dynamics that had led to this moment. "I'll clear my schedule for tomorrow afternoon. Shall we say 2 o'clock? After hanging up, I walked through my house with new eyes, seeing it not as the family gathering place I'd intended it to be, but as the monument to wealth it had actually become. Every room held memories of family celebrations where conversations had inevitably turned to financial discussions. The dining room where holiday meals had been interrupted by requests for business advice. The living room where Christmas mornings had been overshadowed by discussions of college costs and mortgage refinancing. Even the photo gallery that lined the main hallway told a story I was only now beginning to understand. Pictures from family vacations I'd funded, graduation ceremonies for degrees I'd paid for, wedding celebrations where I'd covered most of the expenses, business opening events for ventures I'd financed, a visual history of my generosity and their acceptance of it. But scattered among these formal portraits were candid shots that revealed a different narrative. Thomas and me working in the garden together, genuine smiles and muddy hands. Me with Maria's children during their occasional visits. Natural interactions. With kids who saw me as a person rather than a benefactor. Pictures from charity events where I was surrounded by people who valued my contributions but didn't expect them as a matter of course. The contrast was stark and painful. The relationships where money wasn't the primary connection were warm, spontaneous, authentic. The relationships where financial support was central were formal, stilted, conditional. That evening, I called my financial advisor, Patricia Chen, who had been managing my investment portfolio for over a decade. Patricia was brilliant, discreet, and completely professional in all our dealings. She also happened to be about my daughter Sarah's age, which made the contrast in their treatment of me particularly sharp. "Mrs. Butler, how lovely to hear from you. I hope you had a wonderful vacation with your family." It was enlightening. "Patricia, I'm calling because I want to discuss some major changes to my financial strategy, changes that will affect both my current giving patterns and my long-term estate planning." Patricia had handled enough wealthy clients to recognize the significance of such a statement. "Of course. Would you like to schedule a comprehensive review? I can block out whatever time you need. Actually, I'd like to start with some immediate modifications. I want to establish new restrictions on family trust disbursements, effective this week. And I want to explore options for redirecting a significant portion of my estate towards charitable organizations. The silence on the other end of the line lasted several seconds. Patricia was undoubtedly calculating the implications of what I was suggesting, not just the financial complexity, but the family dynamics that would drive such dramatic changes. That's certainly something we can structure, Mrs. Butler. There are various approaches we could take, depending on your specific objectives. Perhaps we should meet in person to discuss the details. We scheduled a meeting for later in the week, after I'd had time to work through the legal documentation with Richard. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mix of anxiety and relief. For the first time in decades, I was making financial decisions based on my own priorities rather than my family's expectations. The next morning brought a text message from Sarah that perfectly illustrated the dynamic I was working to change. Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation on the yacht. The gallery opportunity is moving quickly, and I'd love to discuss the investment timeline with you. Can we talk this week? No inquiry about my well-being after the abrupt departure from the resort. No acknowledgement that abandoning me at breakfast might have been hurtful. Just a direct transition from family vacation to business opportunity, as if one naturally led to the other. I stared at the message for several minutes, imagining how I might have responded just a week earlier. I would have called immediately, eager to discuss her plans, probably ready to write a check before fully understanding the business model. The old Laura would have been thrilled that her daughter wanted to include her in such an important decision. But the new Laura, the one who had awakened to reality in a hotel lobby, saw the message for what it really was. Another transaction disguised as family connection. Sarah wasn't reaching out because she missed me or wanted to share her excitement about the gallery. She was reaching out because she needed funding, and she'd learned over the years that prompt follow-up to family gatherings usually yielded the best financial results. I set the phone aside without responding. There would be time for conversations about Sarah's gallery after she received my letter, after the new parameters were established, after we both understood what our relationship would look like without the promise of maternal financing. My meeting with Richard was scheduled for that afternoon, and I spent the morning refining my thoughts about what changes I wanted to make. The process felt similar to preparing for a major business negotiation, except the stakes were deeply personal rather than merely financial. Richard's office occupied the top floor of a renovated Victorian mansion in the historic district, with Persian rugs, antique furnishings, and an atmosphere of old money discretion that had always made me feel comfortable discussing sensitive matters. His assistant brought us coffee in delicate china cups, while Richard reviewed the preliminary notes I'd provided about my intentions. Laura, these are substantial changes you're proposing. Before we discuss the mechanics, I want to make sure I understand the underlying objectives. Are you looking to incentivize different behavior from your children, or are you fundamentally restructuring the inheritance framework? The question was tactfully phrased, but I could hear the concern beneath Richard's professional demeanor. He'd witnessed enough family wealth disputes to understand how financial decisions could destroy relationships permanently. Both, actually. I want to end the pattern of ongoing financial support that has characterized my relationships with my children for decades. And I want to ensure that my estate ultimately benefits people and organizations that will use it meaningfully rather than simply expect it as an entitlement. Richard made careful notes while I explained my reasoning, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly listening with the focused attention that had made him one of the region's most respected estate attorneys. I understand your frustration, Laura, and your objectives are certainly achievable from a legal standpoint. But I have to ask, have you discussed these feelings with your children? Sometimes family dynamics can be addressed through conversation, rather than legal restructuring. I appreciated his caution, but I'd moved beyond the point where conversation seemed viable. "Richard, I've been funding their lives for so long that they can't imagine relating to me any other way. Conversation would just give them an opportunity to adjust their approach temporarily while planning their next financial request." He nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in my assessment. Richard had seen enough wealthy families navigate similar challenges to understand that money often corrupted relationships in ways that couldn't be fixed through discussion alone. "In that case, let's talk about implementation. I assume you want to fulfill any existing commitments before establishing the new parameters?" "Exactly. I don't want to leave anyone in a financial crisis because of timing. But going forward, they need to understand that my role as their personal bank is ending." We spent the next 2 hours working through the legal framework for my new approach: trust fund modifications that would eliminate discretionary distributions, changes to my will that would redirect significant portions of my estate toward charitable organizations, establishment of clear boundaries around future financial assistance. The process was complex but liberating. For the first time in years, I was making decisions about my money based on my own values rather than my family's expectations. The wealth that Thomas and I had built together would ultimately serve purposes we would both have been proud of, rather than simply enabling the next generation's financial dependence. "There's one more thing, Richard. I want to establish a foundation focused on supporting elderly individuals who have been abandoned or neglected by their families. There are more people in my situation than most people realize." Richard looked up from his notes with genuine surprise. "That's a very specific focus, Laura. And a very personal one, I imagine. More personal than you know. I've discovered that wealth doesn't protect you from being treated as disposable by the people you love most. If my experience can somehow help others in similar situations, then maybe something positive will come from this painful lesson." As we concluded the meeting, Richard assured me that the preliminary documentation would be ready within a few days, with full implementation possible within 2 weeks. The speed surprised me until I remembered that I was paying substantial fees for priority service, just as my children had learned to expect priority consideration for their financial requests. That evening, I finally mailed the 3 letters I'd written at the resort. Standing at the mailbox at the end of my driveway, holding envelopes that would fundamentally alter the most important relationships in my life, I felt a mix of terror and relief that reminded me of making my first major business investment decades earlier. The die was cast. Within a few days, my children would understand that the woman who had funded their lives for so long was stepping back from that role permanently. They would have to decide whether they valued our relationships enough to rebuild them on a foundation of mutual respect rather than financial dependence. Back in the house, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in Thomas's old chair in the living room, surrounded by family photos that now looked like artifacts from a different era. The woman in those pictures had been generous to a fault, loving without boundaries, giving without expecting reciprocity. She had believed that her children's financial success would translate into family happiness, that solving their problems would earn their gratitude and affection. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone who understood the difference between being needed and being valued, between being generous and being used. The transition was painful, but it was also necessary. At 73, I was finally learning to love myself enough to demand the same quality of love I'd been giving others. My phone buzzed with another message, this time from Michael. "Mom, I've been running numbers on the expansion project we discussed. The timing might be perfect with current interest rates. Could we set up a call this week?" The irony was almost amusing. Less than a week after abandoning me at a hotel breakfast, he was ready to discuss business as if nothing had happened. The message confirmed everything I'd come to understand about our relationship. I was valuable to him as a source of capital, not as his mother. I deleted the message without responding, just as I had with Sarah's earlier text. Soon enough, They would understand that the rules of engagement had changed permanently. The mother who had always been available to solve their financial problems was retired from that position, effective immediately. Over the next few days, I threw myself into the legal and financial restructuring with the same intensity I'd once applied to growing my business empire. Patricia Chen and I spent hours reviewing investment portfolios, identifying assets that could be moved into charitable trusts, calculating the tax implications of my new philanthropic strategy. The numbers were staggering even to me. Over the years, I'd accumulated wealth far beyond what any one person could reasonably spend in a lifetime. The modest construction business that Thomas had started had grown into a diversified portfolio worth more than I'd ever imagined possible when I was that scared young widow learning to read financial statements. "Mrs. Butler," Patricia said, "during one of our planning sessions, the foundation you're establishing will have the resources to help thousands of elderly individuals over the coming decades. The impact could be transformational for that population." She was right, of course, but the irony wasn't lost on me. I was creating a foundation to help abandoned elderly people while being abandoned myself by the family I'd spent decades supporting. My pain was becoming someone else's pathway to healing. The legal documentation was completed faster than Richard had initially projected, partly because of my willingness to pay premium fees for expedited service, but mostly because the changes I was making were straightforward once the objectives were clear. I was simplifying rather than complicating my financial life, cutting off streams of obligation that had been flowing for decades. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after mailing the letters to my children, my phone rang with Michael's number. I let it go to voicemail, not yet ready for the conversations that were inevitably coming. An hour later, Sarah called, then David 20 minutes after that. By the end of the day, I had 7 missed calls and 3 increasingly urgent text messages asking me to call back immediately. I didn't respond to any of them. They had managed to ignore me for a week after leaving me stranded at the resort, and they could manage to wait a few more days while I finished implementing the changes that would define our relationships going forward. The irony of our reversed positions wasn't lost on me. For decades, I had been the one calling them, reaching out to maintain connection, initiating conversations about their lives and needs. Now they were the ones desperately trying to reach me, probably for the first time since they'd become adults. But their urgency had nothing to do with concern for my well-being and everything to do with the implications of the letters they'd received. They weren't calling because they'd realized how badly they'd treated me. They were calling because they'd realized the potential impact on their financial security. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I ignored my phone completely. I worked in the garden where Thomas and I had planned to spend our retirement, read books I'd been meaning to enjoy for months, and took long walks around my property without the constant background anxiety about which child needed what assistance. The silence was profound and healing. For the first time in decades, I wasn't managing anyone else's crises, solving anyone else's problems, or funding anyone else's dreams. I was simply Laura Butler, a woman with her own interests and priorities, finally free to explore what her life could look like when it wasn't defined by other people's needs. Maria noticed the change immediately. "You seem more relaxed this week, Mrs. Butler. The vacation must have been very good for you." If she only knew. The vacation had been a disaster in every conventional sense, but it had been the catalyst for the most important transformation of my adult life. I was learning to value my own peace of mind over my children's financial convenience, my own dignity over their inherited expectations. On Sunday evening, I finally listened to the voicemails that had accumulated over the past few days. Michael's messages progressed from confusion to concern to barely controlled panic as he realized the implications of my letter. Sarah's calls were more emotional, mixing hurt feelings with financial anxiety in ways that would have been manipulative if they hadn't been so transparently desperate. David's messages were the most direct, demanding explanations and immediate conversations about what he called this misunderstanding. None of them expressed genuine concern for my emotional well-being. None acknowledged that their behavior at the resort might have been hurtful. None suggested that they wanted to rebuild our relationships for any reason other than financial necessity. Their responses confirmed every conclusion I'd reached about the nature of our connections. They loved my money more than they loved me, and removing the money had revealed the poverty of emotion that remained. But I wasn't angry anymore, just profoundly sad. These were the children I'd raised, the people I'd hoped would be my companions in old age, my partners in creating lasting family traditions. Instead, they were essentially strangers who happened to share my DNA and my financial resources. The sadness was overwhelming at times, but it was clean sadness, honest grief for relationships that had never really existed in the form I'd imagined. It was better than the confused pain I'd been carrying for years, the nagging sense that something was wrong with our family dynamics but not understanding what it was or how to fix it. Now I understood exactly what was wrong, and I'd taken definitive steps to address it. The outcome was uncertain. My children might learn to relate to me differently, or they might disappear from my life entirely. But either way, I would know where I stood with them, and that knowledge was worth more than any amount of money I might have given them. As I prepared for bed that Sunday night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Anticipation for the future, rather. Then anxiety about managing other people's expectations. I was 73 years old, wealthy beyond most people's dreams, and finally free to discover who Laura Butler could become when she wasn't defined by her role as the family bank. The woman who had awakened in that hotel lobby was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept anything less than authentic love from the people in her life. It had taken 7 decades to learn that lesson, but it wasn't too late to put it into practice. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything seem sharper, more vivid than usual. I woke before dawn, something that had become my habit over the years, and made coffee in the kitchen that had once been the heart of our family gatherings. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if removing the weight of financial obligation had actually changed the atmosphere within these walls. I was reviewing quarterly reports from my property management company when the doorbell rang at 8:30. Maria wasn't scheduled to arrive until 10, and I rarely received unannounced visitors, especially so early in the morning. Through the front window, I could see Michael's black Mercedes in my driveway, its engine still running as if he wasn't sure he'd be staying long. He stood on my front porch looking older than his 45 years, his usually pristine appearance showing signs of stress. His tie was slightly askew, his hair uncombed in a way that suggested he'd driven here directly after reading my letter without taking time for his usual morning routine. The confident contractor who'd built a successful business had been replaced by an anxious son who suddenly wasn't sure of his place in the world. "Mom, we need to talk." His voice carried a mixture of desperation and demand that I'd never heard from him before. "I got your letter, and I don't understand what's happening. Can I come in?" I opened the door and stepped aside, noting how he moved into my house with less assurance than usual. Michael had always carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly where he stood in every relationship, but that certainty seemed to have abandoned him entirely. We settled in my living room, him on the edge of the sofa as if ready to bolt, me in my usual chair by the window. The morning light streaming through the glass seemed to highlight every line of worry on his face, every sign that the comfortable world he'd known for decades was suddenly shifting beneath his feet. "Mom, what is this about? Your letter. It doesn't make sense. You're talking about ending financial support, about restructuring your estate, about us not appreciating you. Where is this coming from?" The genuine confusion in his voice almost broke my resolve. This was my firstborn, the baby I'd rocked through countless sleepless nights, the toddler who'd followed me around the construction sites when Thomas was building our business. But the man sitting across from me now was a stranger who seemed genuinely bewildered that his mother might want something from their relationship, besides the opportunity to solve his problems. Michael, when was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? Not because you needed advice or assistance, but simply because you wanted to hear my voice. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching recognition. I could see him mentally reviewing our conversations over the past months, searching for evidence that would contradict what we both knew to be true. We talk all the time, Mom. Just last week at the resort, we spent hours together. We spent hours in the same location, Michael. But when did you ask me about my life, my interests, my thoughts about anything that didn't relate to your business or your family's needs? The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of realizations he was trying to avoid. I watched emotions play across his face: denial, anger, hurt, and finally a reluctant acknowledgement that my questions had exposed something he'd been unconsciously understanding for years. I didn't realize. I thought you enjoyed helping us. You always seemed so willing to discuss our projects, our plans. I was willing because I love you, Michael. But somewhere along the way, discussing your plans became the only way we connected. You stopped seeing me as your mother and started seeing me as your financial advisor. He shifted uncomfortably, probably recognizing the truth in my words, but not yet ready to accept their implications. But that's not. We have a relationship beyond money. We're family. Are we? Tell me something about my life that has nothing to do with your inheritance or your family's financial needs. What books have I been reading? What charities am I passionate about? What do I worry about when I can't sleep at night? The questions hung in the air like accusations, which in many ways they were. I was forcing my son to confront the reality that he knew virtually nothing about my inner life, my personal struggles, my individual identity beyond my role as his mother and benefactor. That's not fair, Mom. You never talk about those things. You always want to hear about our lives, our challenges. Because that's what I thought being a good mother meant, Michael. I thought supporting you required putting my own needs aside, making your problems my priority, ensuring your success at the expense of my own fulfillment. I could see him struggling to process this information, trying to reconcile the mother he'd known with the woman sitting across from him now. The Laura Butler he'd understood was endlessly giving, perpetually available, consistently focused on her family's welfare. This version, the one demanding reciprocity and recognition, was unfamiliar territory. So what happens now? You're just cutting us off? Punishing us for accepting help we thought you wanted to give? The word punishing stung because it suggested he still didn't understand the fundamental issue. This wasn't about punishment or even about money, really. It was about the possibility of authentic relationship, something that couldn't exist while financial dependency defined our interactions. I'm not cutting you off, Michael. I'm changing the parameters of our relationship. If you want to spend time with me, call me, include me in your life, I'd welcome that more than you know. But I won't continue funding your decisions while being excluded from your emotional world. He was quiet for several minutes, staring at his hands, processing implications that went far beyond the immediate financial concerns that had driven him to my door. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed, showing a vulnerability I hadn't seen since he was a child. I didn't know you felt this way. Why didn't you say something before now? Because I didn't want to believe it myself, Michael. It's taken me years to admit that I've been buying my children's attention instead of earning their genuine affection. The conversation continued for another hour, covering ground that should have been explored decades earlier. Michael asked questions I'd been waiting years to hear, expressed concerns about our relationship that went beyond financial implications, and showed flashes of the son I'd hoped he might become if given the chance to see me as a person rather than a resource. But underneath his newfound awareness, I could sense the real reason for his visit. The expansion project he'd mentioned during our vacation, the substantial capital investment that would require external financing if I wasn't available to provide it. His confusion about my letter was genuine, but so was his anxiety about the practical implications of my decision. When he finally left, promising to call within a few days to continue our conversation, I felt cautiously optimistic. Perhaps Michael was capable of evolving beyond the transactional dynamic that had characterized our relationship for so long. Perhaps removing the financial component would allow space for something more authentic to develop. But my optimism was tempered by realism. 45 years of learned behavior doesn't change overnight, and Michael's immediate response to my letter had been to show up demanding explanations rather than calling to express concern for my emotional well-being. The road to genuine relationship would be long and uncertain, if it was possible at all. Sarah arrived that afternoon, her approach as different from Michael's as their personalities had always been. Where he had been direct and demanding, she was emotional and manipulative, arriving with tears already flowing and a carefully prepared speech about family bonds and misunderstandings. "Mama, I can't believe you think we don't love you. How could you say such hurtful things in that letter? We're family. We're supposed to support each other through difficult times." The use of mama instead of her usual mom was calculated to evoke memories of her childhood, when she'd been my artistic dreamer who painted watercolors and wrote poetry about flowers. But the woman sitting across from me now was a skilled emotional manipulator who'd learned to use sentiment as effectively as Michael used logic. "Sarah, I know you love me, but I've come to understand that there are different kinds of love, and the kind I've been receiving feels more like appreciation for services rendered than genuine emotional connection." "That's not true, and you know it. Yes, we've accepted your help over the years, but that's because you offered it. You've always been so generous, so willing to solve our problems. We thought that's how you showed love." Her tears were real, but so was the underlying strategy. Sarah had always been the most emotionally intelligent of my children, the one who understood how to appeal to my maternal instincts most effectively. She was using those skills now, trying to reframe my withdrawal as a misunderstanding rather than a necessary correction to an unhealthy dynamic. "Sarah, when was the last time you invited me to spend time with you that didn't involve a family obligation or a request for assistance? When did you last call just to share something wonderful that happened in your life?" She paused in her crying, clearly thinking through the same mental inventory that had stymied Michael. The silence stretched long enough for us both to understand what her review had revealed. "But that doesn't mean we don't care about you. We're all busy, Mom. We have jobs and families and responsibilities. It's hard to find time for social calls." "You find time for what you prioritize, Sarah. And clearly, I haven't been a priority unless you needed something from me." The conversation followed a similar pattern to my morning discussion with Michael, but with more emotional intensity and less rational analysis. Sarah was hurt, genuinely confused, and increasingly desperate as she began to understand that my decision wasn't a negotiating tactic, but a fundamental change in how I viewed our relationship. "What about the gallery, Mom? We've been planning this for months. You said you thought it was a wonderful project, that you were proud of my vision." And there it was, the real reason for her visit. Not concern for my feelings or desire to repair our relationship, but anxiety about the financial implications of my letter for her artistic dreams. "The gallery is a wonderful project, Sarah, and if it's truly your passion, you'll find a way to make it happen without my funding. Business loans, investors, crowdfunding, there are many ways to finance a venture when you're genuinely committed to its success. But we've already told the seller that we're serious buyers. We've made commitments based on the understanding that you'd be our primary investor. Then you made commitments based on assumptions rather than confirmed agreements. I never actually committed to funding the gallery, Sarah. You assumed I would because I'd funded everything else in your life. The truth of that statement hit both of us like a physical blow. She had assumed my support because I'd never refused. Because I'd trained all my children to expect that their financial needs would be my immediate priority. I had created this dynamic through decades of consistent behavior, and now I was unilaterally changing the rules without warning. But the warning signs had been there for anyone who cared to look. Years of conversations that centered entirely on their needs. Holidays that became planning sessions for their next financial requirements. Family gatherings that felt more like board meetings than celebrations. Sarah left in tears, promising to think about what I'd said, but clearly devastated by the implications, for her gallery project. I watched her drive away, feeling the same mixture of relief and sadness that had followed Michael's departure. These conversations were necessary, but they were also heartbreaking confirmations of how little my children understood about my inner life or emotional needs. David's response was characteristically different from his siblings. Where Michael had been confused and Sarah emotional, David approached the situation like the financial professional he was, arriving with a laptop and a prepared presentation about the economic implications of my decision. Mom, I've run some preliminary calculations based on the changes outlined in your letter, and I think you may not fully understand the long-term consequences of what you're proposing. He opened his laptop and launched into a detailed analysis of my estate planning modifications, complete with charts showing potential tax implications and projections about charitable giving strategies. It was the kind of thorough professional analysis I might have appreciated in a business context. But as a response to my emotional crisis, it felt coldly impersonal. David, this isn't about tax efficiency or long-term financial planning. This is about the fact that you see me as a portfolio to be managed rather than a mother to be loved. He looked genuinely puzzled by my statement, as if I'd criticized him for being too good at his job rather than too distant in our relationship. I'm trying to help you make informed decisions, Mom. These changes you're proposing could cost the family millions of dollars in unnecessary taxes and lost opportunities. The family, David? Or you and your siblings specifically? The distinction seemed to confuse him even more. In his mind, protecting the family's financial interests was the same as protecting our relationships, because he'd never learned to separate emotional connection from economic advantage. I don't understand the difference. We're all family. Your financial well-being affects all of us, just like our success reflects well on you. It was perhaps the most honest thing any of my children had said during these difficult conversations. David genuinely couldn't see the difference between loving me and valuing my money, because in his experience, they'd always been the same thing. David, do you know anything about my life that doesn't relate to finances? My hobbies? My fears? My dreams for the future? He stared at me with the same blank expression I'd seen on his siblings' faces when asked similar questions. These intelligent, successful adults had somehow reached middle age, without ever considering that their mother might have an identity beyond her role as their supporter and benefactor. You like gardening, he said finally, grasping for any personal detail he could remember. And you read a lot. Mystery novels, I think. The pathetic inadequacy of his response would have been funny if it hadn't been so tragic. This was my youngest child, the baby I'd nursed through pneumonia and helped with homework every night for years. And the sum total of his knowledge about my personal interests could be summarized in 2 incomplete sentences. Our conversation lasted longer than the others, partly because David was determined to convince me that my financial restructuring was economically irrational, and partly because I kept hoping he might eventually ask about my emotional state rather than my investment strategy. He never did. Even when I explained the loneliness I'd been feeling, the sense of being valued only for my wealth, the pain of being abandoned at the resort, his responses focused on practical solutions rather than emotional understanding. If you're feeling isolated, Mom, Maybe you should consider moving to a senior community where there are more social opportunities. There are some very nice places in the area, with golf courses and activity centers. The suggestion that I should solve my loneliness by paying to live somewhere else rather than expecting meaningful relationships with my own family was so perfectly David that I almost laughed. In his mind, every problem could be solved with the right financial strategy, including emotional problems. When he finally left, armed with promises to research alternative estate planning approaches that might address my concerns while minimizing tax implications, I felt the deepest sadness yet. David was the most lost of my children, so disconnected from emotional reality that he couldn't even recognize the poverty of his own responses. That evening, I sat in my garden watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink that would have taken Sarah's artistic breath away if she'd been there to see it with me rather than driving home to calculate the financial impact of my decision on her gallery dreams. The beauty of the moment was tinged with melancholy, but it was also peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced for years. For the first time in decades, I was completely alone with my thoughts, free from the constant background anxiety about which child needed what assistance, which crisis required my immediate financial intervention. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer, Michael's wife. "Laura, Michael told me about your conversation today. I hope you know how much we all love and appreciate you. Maybe we could meet for lunch this week to talk about everything?" The message was carefully crafted to sound personal and caring, but I could read between the lines. Jennifer was worried about the expansion project, about the capital Michael needed for his business growth. She was reaching out not because she cared about my emotional well-being, but because she understood that maintaining good relationships with me was essential to her family's financial security. I didn't respond to the text, just as I hadn't responded to most of the messages I'd received since mailing those letters. The old Laura would have been flattered by the attention, pleased that her family was finally reaching out to her. But the new Laura understood that their sudden interest in communication was entirely self-serving. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Phone calls I didn't answer, text messages I didn't return, emails that arrived with increasing urgency as my children realized that their usual emotional manipulation tactics weren't working. They were experiencing something they'd never had to face before, the possibility that their mother might not be available to them on their terms. I spent those days working with Richard and Patricia to finalize the legal and financial changes I'd initiated. The process was complex but satisfying, like cleaning out closets that had been cluttered for years. Each trust fund modification, each charitable designation, each removed beneficiary felt like a step toward reclaiming my own life from the expectations that had defined it for so long. The foundation I was establishing to help abandoned elderly people was taking shape beautifully. The legal framework was sound, the funding was substantial, and the mission was deeply personal. I would be able to help thousands of people who found themselves in situations similar to mine, elderly individuals whose families saw them as burdens rather than blessings. "Mrs. Butler," Patricia said during one of our planning sessions, "this foundation will be one of the most well-funded organizations of its kind in the country. The impact on the elderly population could be transformational." She was right, but the irony remained bitter. I was creating an institution to address the exact problem I was experiencing in my own life, using wealth that my children expected to inherit to help people whose families had abandoned them, just as mine had abandoned me. The preliminary legal documents were completed by Thursday of that week, establishing the new parameters for family financial support and redirecting significant portions of my estate toward charitable purposes. The changes weren't irreversible, but they were comprehensive enough to make my intentions clear to anyone who might have been hoping this was a temporary emotional reaction rather than a permanent restructuring. Richard had insisted on including provisions that would allow me to modify the arrangements if circumstances changed, but I couldn't imagine what would convince me to return to the old dynamic. The past week had confirmed everything I'd suspected about the nature of my relationships with my children. Remove the money, and what remained was a collection of polite strangers who shared my genetic material, but not my values or priorities. Friday morning brought a surprise visitor, Patricia, David's wife, arriving alone and clearly nervous about whatever conversation she was planning to initiate. Unlike my children, who had all approached me with some combination of confusion, emotion, or financial analysis, Patricia seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being. "Laura, I hope you don't mind me stopping by like this. David told me about your conversation earlier this week, and I've been thinking about what you said. I wanted to talk to you myself. Patricia and I had always had a cordial relationship, but we'd never been particularly close. She was David's second wife, someone who'd entered our family when most of the emotional patterns were already established. Perhaps that outside perspective had allowed her to see things my own children couldn't recognize. Of course, Patricia. Would you like some coffee?" We settled on my back porch overlooking the garden, and I waited for her to explain why she'd come. Patricia was normally reserved, someone who preferred to let David handle family communications, so her solo visit was unprecedented. "Laura, I need to tell you something that David probably won't. He's been upset all week, not just about the financial implications of your letter, but about what you said regarding your relationship with the children." I was surprised by her directness, and even more surprised by the genuine concern in her voice. This was the first conversation I'd had since mailing those letters where someone seemed more worried about my emotional state than about the financial consequences of my decisions. "He's been questioning himself, wondering if he's failed you somehow as a son. He doesn't know how to talk about emotions the way you were asking him to, but that doesn't mean he doesn't feel them." Patricia's insight was astute and painful. David had inherited his father's practical approach to problem solving, but Thomas had balanced that practicality with emotional awareness that David had never developed. In David's world, showing love meant solving problems efficiently, not engaging in emotional conversations about feelings and needs. But, Patricia, intention isn't enough anymore. I've spent decades making excuses for their inability to connect with me emotionally. At some point, you have to accept that people show you who they are through their choices, not their explanations. She nodded slowly, acknowledging the validity of my perspective while still advocating for her husband. "I understand your frustration, Laura, and I think you're right that things needed to change. But maybe there's a middle ground between cutting them off entirely and continuing the old patterns." We talked for over an hour, the longest substantive conversation I'd had with Patricia in the years she'd been part of our family. She shared observations about our family dynamics that were remarkably perceptive, acknowledged the legitimate basis for my complaints, and suggested approaches for rebuilding relationships that might actually work. What if you gave them a chance to prove they can relate to you differently? Not immediately, but gradually, as they learn to see you as a person rather than a resource. The suggestion was appealing, but I'd tried gradual approaches for years without success. My children's behavior had been so consistent for so long that I doubted their ability to change, even when faced with the loss of financial support. "Patricia, I appreciate your perspective, and I'm grateful that you care enough to come here and advocate for David, but I've made these changes because I finally accepted that the old patterns were damaging to everyone involved. Going back to those patterns, even gradually, would just recreate the same problems." When Patricia left, she promised to continue working with David on developing better emotional communication skills, and I promised to remain open to authentic relationship if he could demonstrate genuine change. It was the most hopeful conversation I'd had all week, but hope felt dangerous after so many years of disappointment. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I attended a local art exhibition opening, not because I was considering purchasing anything or supporting someone's career, but simply because I wanted to enjoy beautiful artwork in a social setting. The experience was revelatory, reminding me that there was an entire world of interesting people and engaging activities that had nothing to do with my family's financial needs. I struck up conversations with strangers about the paintings, shared observations about artistic technique, and exchanged contact information with several women who seemed interested in developing friendships based on shared interests rather than economic advantage. For the first time in years, I was interacting with people who knew nothing about my wealth and were interested in me purely as a person. The contrast with my family relationships was stark and painful, but it was also liberating. These strangers treated me with more genuine warmth and respect in one evening than my own children had shown in months. They asked about my opinions, listened to my responses, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me better. Driving home that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Excitement about the possibility of new relationships, new experiences, new ways of defining myself beyond my role as mother and benefactor. At 73, I was discovering that life could still hold surprises, that there were still opportunities for growth and connection that had nothing to do with family obligations or financial responsibilities. The woman who had awakened in that hotel lobby was truly gone now, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept substitutes for genuine love. The process had been painful beyond words, but it had also been necessary. For the first time in decades, I was living according to my own values rather than other people's expectations, and the freedom was intoxicating. My children would have to decide whether they valued our relationships enough to rebuild them on a foundation of mutual respect and authentic caring. Some might rise to the challenge, others might disappear entirely. But either way, I would finally know who Laura Butler was when she wasn't defined by her willingness to solve other people's problems with her checkbook. The future was uncertain, but it was also full of possibility in ways it hadn't been for years. And that possibility, purchased at such a high emotional cost, felt like the most valuable investment I'd ever made. 3 months had passed since I'd restructured my financial relationships with my children, and the silence from them had been deafening. After that initial week of desperate phone calls and urgent visits, they'd gradually accepted that I wasn't going to reverse my decision or engage in negotiations about partial funding for their various projects. The woman who had always been available to solve their problems had permanently retired from that position. I'd thrown myself into my new life with an energy that surprised even me. The Foundation for Abandoned Elderly People was officially operational, with a full-time staff, and a waiting list of individuals seeking assistance. The art appreciation group I'd joined met twice monthly, and I'd developed genuine friendships with women who knew me as Laura, the person rather than Laura, the benefactor. My garden had never looked better, tended with the attention I'd previously devoted to managing other people's crises. But the absence of my children's voices in my life created a hollow space that even my newfound freedom couldn't completely fill. I'd gained autonomy and authenticity, but I'd lost the family connections I'd spent decades trying to nurture. The trade-off was necessary, but it wasn't painless. Then, on a crisp October morning, everything changed. I was reviewing quarterly reports in my office when Maria knocked gently on the door. "Mrs. Butler, there's someone here to see you, a young woman who says she's your granddaughter." My heart stopped. None of my grandchildren had ever visited me alone, and certainly not without their parents' knowledge or permission. I followed Maria to the front door, where I found Sophia, Sarah's 17-year-old daughter, standing on my porch with a small suitcase and red-rimmed eyes that suggested she'd been crying. "Grandmother Laura, can I please come in? I need to talk to you about something important." The formality of Grandmother Laura, instead of her usual distant politeness, immediately told me this wasn't a casual visit. I ushered her inside, noting how she moved with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain composure while dealing with significant emotional distress. We sat in my living room, the same space where I'd confronted each of her parents about our deteriorating relationships. But Sophia's presence felt different, more genuine, more vulnerable than any conversation I'd had with my adult children. In years. "Sophia, sweetheart, what's wrong? Does your mother know you're here?" She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, she doesn't know. And she'd probably be furious if she found out. But I had to come see you, grandmother. Laura, I had to tell you what really happened." "What really happened, dear?" "At the hotel, the morning everyone left without you. I know what Mom and Dad told you, about waiting as long as they could and having flights to catch. But that's not what really happened." My blood turned cold. I'd spent months accepting that my family had simply been thoughtless and selfish, prioritizing their travel convenience over basic courtesy. But Sophia's tone suggested something far more deliberate and cruel. "Tell me what you remember." "Sophia." She took a shaky breath, clearly struggling with the decision to reveal family secrets that would fundamentally alter how I understood that morning's events. I was awake early because of the time change, and I heard Mom and Aunt Jennifer talking. In the hallway outside their rooms, they were whispering, but I could hear most of what they said. She paused, looking at her hands, probably realizing that what she was about to tell me would destroy any remaining illusions I had about my children's behavior. Mom said something like, "She's probably going to sleep late after last night's conversation. This might be the perfect opportunity to avoid another emotional scene." And Aunt Jennifer agreed, saying something about how you'd been particularly difficult during the vacation. The words hit me like physical blows. Not only had they abandoned me deliberately, they'd planned it as a strategy to avoid dealing with my emotional needs. I'd been particularly difficult for wanting genuine connection with my family during our reunion. "Sophia, are you certain about what you heard?" "Yes, Grandmother Laura. And there's more." Uncle Michael joined them in the hallway, and they all agreed to check out early and leave before you woke up. Uncle David thought they should at least leave you a note, but Mom said you'd figure it out eventually, and that making a clean break would be easier for everyone. I sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of what Sophia was telling me. The abandonment hadn't been thoughtless or accidental. It had been a calculated decision made by my 3 children, who had conspired to escape the resort without facing the possibility of having to address my concerns about our relationships. "Why are you telling me this now, Sophia? It's been months since the vacation." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, looking younger than her 17 years, but also remarkably mature in her emotional honesty. "Because I've been watching. What's happened since then? How Mom and Dad have been talking about you, the things they've been saying about your letter and the changes you made, and because I've been thinking about what I know about you versus what they think they know about you." "What do you mean?" "Grandmother Laura, do you remember when I was 12 and I got really sick with mono? I was out of school for almost 2 months, and Mom and Dad were both working crazy hours trying to get Dad's new gallery concept off the ground." I did remember. Sophia had been seriously ill, requiring constant care and supervision during her recovery. Sarah and Mark had been overwhelmed trying to manage her care while pursuing a business opportunity that ultimately hadn't worked out. "You came and stayed with us for 3 weeks, remember? You took care of me every day, read to me, helped me with schoolwork, made me laugh when I felt awful. You didn't just write a check to solve the problem. You gave your time, your attention, your love." The memory was vivid and precious to me, but I was surprised that Sophia remembered it so clearly. She'd been sick and medicated for much of that time, and I'd assumed the experience had been lost in a haze of childhood illness. "I remember everything about those weeks, Grandmother Laura. How you made that special soup recipe when I couldn't keep anything else down. How you stayed up all night when my fever spiked because you were worried about me. How you taught me to play chess during the boring recovery time." Tears were flowing freely down her face now, but she continued with determined honesty that reminded me painfully of myself at her age. "That's who you really are, Grandmother Laura. Not the woman Mom and Dad describe as demanding and unreasonable, but the person who dropped everything to take care of a sick grandchild because that's what family does for each other. I was crying now, too, overwhelmed by the realization that someone in my family had actually seen and remembered the real me, the woman who gave love rather than just money, who showed up when people needed her presence rather than her checkbook. Mom and Dad don't understand what they lost when you stopped giving them money. They think you're being vindictive or manipulative, trying to force them to pay attention to you. But I know better. I know you're just tired of being seen as a bank account instead of a grandmother. The accuracy of her assessment was staggering. This teenager understood the dynamics that had shaped our family for decades better than her parents or uncles did. She'd seen through the financial complications to the emotional truth underneath. "Sophia, what's brought this on now? Why are you here today?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to me with trembling fingers. "Because I found this yesterday, and I couldn't keep quiet anymore." I unfolded the paper and immediately recognized Sarah's handwriting. It was a letter addressed to a lawyer, apparently drafted but never sent, exploring the possibility of challenging my estate planning changes on the grounds of diminished mental capacity. The letter detailed my erratic behavior during the family vacation, my sudden and irrational decision to cut off financial support, and my obsessive focus on imagined slights and emotional manipulation. It suggested that I might be suffering from early-stage dementia or depression that was affecting my judgment about family relationships. The betrayal was so complete, so vicious, that I could barely comprehend what I was reading. Not only had Sarah dismissed my emotional needs as mental illness, she was actively exploring legal strategies to override my decisions and regain access to my wealth. "I confronted Mom about the letter yesterday," Sophia continued. "I told her I thought what she was planning was wrong, that you weren't mentally ill, just hurt by how everyone had been treating you. She got angry and said I didn't understand adult relationships or financial responsibilities." "What did you say to that?" "I told her that maybe I didn't understand adult relationships, but I understood grandmother relationships, and she was failing at hers. I told her that you'd been more of a parent to me during those 3 weeks when I was sick than she'd been during most of my childhood." The courage it must have taken for a 17-year-old to confront her mother about such fundamental family issues was extraordinary. Sophia was risking her own relationship with her parents to defend me, something my adult children had never been willing to do for each other, let alone for me. She told me I was being disrespectful and that I didn't understand the sacrifices she and Dad have made for our family. Then she said that if I was so concerned about you, maybe I should go live with you instead of criticizing her choices. "Is that why you're here with a suitcase?" "Partly, but also because I realized that I want to know you better, Grandmother Laura. The real you, not the version Mom and Dad talk about when they're complaining about money. I want to learn from you, spend time with you, hear your stories about grandfather, Thomas, and building the business and raising 3 kids as a single mother. The generosity of her offer, the maturity of her perspective, the courage of her decision to leave her parents' house to come to me. It was everything I'd hoped for from my family but never received. And it was coming from the person I'd least expected to understand the complexities of our family dynamics. Sophia, honey, I'm deeply touched that you want to spend time with me. But you can't just leave your parents' house without their permission. You're still a minor, and they have legal authority over your living arrangements. Actually, I turn 18 next month, and I've already been accepted for early admission to state university starting in January. I was planning to live in the dorms, but I could live here instead and commute to classes. That is, if you'd want me here. The possibility of having Sophia as a companion, of finally having someone in my family who saw me as a person worth knowing rather than a resource to be managed, was more appealing than she could possibly understand. But I was also wary of creating new family conflicts or putting her in an impossible position with her parents. What do your parents think about your early admission to college? They're proud of my academic achievements, but they're also worried about the cost. College tuition keeps going up, and with the gallery project not working out after you stopped funding it, money's been tight. They've been talking about community college for the first 2 years to save money. The irony was perfect. Sarah and Mark were struggling to afford their daughter's education because they'd become dependent on my financial support instead of developing sustainable business models. Now they were considering limiting their daughter's opportunities because they couldn't access the money they'd learned to expect from me. Sophia, if you really want to live here and attend the university, I'd be delighted to have your company. But I need you to understand that this can't be a way for your parents to indirectly access my financial support. If you live here, it's because we want to build a genuine relationship, not because I'm providing free room and board to reduce their expenses. I understand, Grandmother Laura, and I want you to know that I'm not here because Mom and Dad sent me to try to change your mind about the money. They don't even know I'm here, and they'd probably be furious if they knew about this conversation. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking, really talking, in a way I hadn't experienced with any family member since Thomas died. Sophia asked about my childhood, my marriage, the early days of building the business. She wanted to hear stories about her mother's childhood, about family traditions that had been lost over the years, about the values and principles that had guided my decisions. In return, she shared her own dreams and concerns, her thoughts about college and career plans, her observations about our family dynamics that were remarkably insightful for someone her age. She was intelligent, thoughtful, and refreshingly honest about the problems she'd observed in her parents' relationship with me. I've always wondered why you kept giving them money when they treated you like an obligation rather than a person, she said during one of our conversations. Even as a kid, I could see that they called you when they needed something but didn't seem interested in spending time with you otherwise. Why didn't you ever say anything before now? Because I was a kid, and kids aren't supposed to criticize their parents. But also because I thought maybe that's just how adult families worked, with everyone focused on practical things instead of emotional connections. The sadness in her voice when she said that broke my heart. This remarkable young woman had grown up thinking that transactional relationships were normal, that family love was supposed to be conditional on financial benefit. No wonder she was so surprised to discover that I'd valued her company during her illness more than any check I'd ever written. As evening approached, we called her parents to let them know where she was. The conversation was predictably difficult, with Sarah demanding that Sophia return home immediately and threatening various consequences if she didn't comply. But when I spoke to Sarah directly, explaining that Sophia was welcome to stay with me through her 18th birthday if she chose to, the tone shifted dramatically. Mom, what are you trying to prove with this? First you cut off our financial support, now you're encouraging our daughter to leave home? What kind of grandmother tries to turn a child against her parents? The kind who's tired of being treated like a financial institution instead of a family member, Sarah. Sophia came here on her own, seeking a relationship with me that you've never bothered to develop. If you want her to come home, maybe you should ask yourself why she felt more comfortable with her estranged grandmother than with her own parents. The call ended with threats of legal action and accusations of emotional manipulation, but also with a grudging acknowledgement that they couldn't force Sophia to return home against her will, especially when she was so close to legal adulthood. That night, as I helped Sophia settle into the guest room that had once hosted family members who saw me as a convenience rather than a person, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about the future. For the first time since Thomas died, I had someone in my life who valued my presence more than my presence, who was interested in my stories more than my bank statements. Over the following weeks, Sophia and I developed a routine that felt more natural and satisfying than any family relationship I'd had in decades. She helped me in the garden, learning about the plants Thomas and I had chosen together and the meaning behind various design decisions. I taught her to cook the recipes that had been family favorites when her mother was young, sharing stories about holiday traditions and daily rituals that had been lost in the chaos of everyone's busy adult lives. Most importantly, we talked about everything and nothing, about serious topics and silly observations, about dreams and fears, and the kind of everyday experiences that form the foundation of genuine relationships. Sophia was curious about my business career, asking detailed questions about the challenges I'd faced as a woman in a male-dominated industry. She wanted to understand how I'd managed to raise 3 children while building a company, how I'd made difficult decisions about work-life balance, how I'd found the courage to take risks that ultimately paid off. In return, she shared her own ambitions and anxieties about the future, her thoughts about career choices and relationship expectations, her concerns about following in her mother's artistic footsteps versus pursuing more practical alternatives. She was wrestling with many of the same questions I'd faced at her age, but with the added complexity of growing up in a family where financial security was assumed rather than earned. "I don't want to be dependent on someone else's money the way Mom has been dependent on yours," she told me one evening as we worked together in the kitchen. "I want to build something of my own, something I can be proud of regardless of what anyone else contributes." The maturity of her perspective, her determination to avoid the patterns that had shaped her parents' relationship with me, gave me hope that perhaps the next generation could learn from the mistakes that had damaged so many family connections. 3 weeks after Sophia's arrival, we received an unexpected visitor. Michael appeared at my door on a Saturday morning, looking haggard and uncertain in a way I'd never seen before. The confident businessman who'd confronted me months earlier had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely humbled by circumstances beyond his control. "Mom, can we talk? I mean really talk. Not like before when I was just trying to understand what you wanted from us." I invited him in, and he was clearly surprised to find Sophia in my kitchen making breakfast, wearing one of my aprons and chattering about plans for planting bulbs in the garden. The easy intimacy between us, the obvious comfort we'd developed with each other, seemed to shake him in ways my angry letters and financial restructuring hadn't. "Sophia told me she's been staying here," he said carefully. "Sarah's been worried sick about her living situation." "Sarah's been worried about losing control over her daughter's choices," I corrected. "Sophia is thriving here, Michael. She's happy, she's engaged with her studies, and she's preparing for college with enthusiasm rather than anxiety about finances." He watched Sophia move around my kitchen with the familiarity of someone who belonged there, and I could see him processing the implications of what he was observing. This was what genuine family connection looked like. Comfortable, natural, based on mutual affection rather than obligation or expectation. "Mom, I need to tell you something. The expansion project I was planning, the one I was hoping you'd help finance, it fell through." I waited for him to continue, not sure whether this was leading to another request for assistance or something else entirely. "I couldn't secure alternative financing without your backing, and I realized that my entire business plan had been based on the assumption that you'd always be available to fund my growth strategies. When I tried to approach other investors, they asked hard questions about cash flow and risk management that I couldn't answer convincingly." This was the first time Michael had ever acknowledged that his business success was partly dependent on my financial support, the first hint that he might be developing some insight into the dynamics that had shaped our relationship. "What I'm trying to say, Mom, is that you were right about me not really knowing you as a person. I've been so focused on building my business, providing for my family, managing all the practical aspects of life, that I never stopped to consider what you might need from our relationship." He paused, looking around my kitchen at the evidence of the life I'd been building with Sophia, the warmth and connection that had been missing from our family interactions for so long. "I don't know how to fix this, Mom. I don't know how to be the son you deserve instead of just the businessman who happened to be your child, but I want to learn, if you're willing to teach me." The humility in his voice, the genuine recognition of what he'd lost through his own choices, was more than I'd ever expected to hear from Michael. But I'd learned to be cautious about accepting apologies that might be motivated more by circumstances than by authentic understanding. Michael, what brought about this change of heart? Is it seeing Sophia here? Or is it the financial reality of not having my support available? Both, if I'm being honest. Losing your financial backing forced me to confront how dependent I'd become on your generosity. But seeing Sophia here, seeing how happy she is with you, made me realize what I'd been missing all these years. He looked directly at me for the first time since arriving, and I could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there during our previous conversations. Genuine regret, authentic recognition of loss. I want to know you the way Sophia knows you, Mom. I want to understand what made you the woman who built all this, who raised 3 kids alone, who created opportunities for so many people. I want to be your son instead of just your business associate. It was everything I'd hoped to hear from him for years, but now that the words were finally being spoken, I felt more sadness than joy. So much time had been wasted. So many opportunities for connection had been missed. So much damage had been done to our relationship that might never be fully repaired. But I also felt something else. A cautious hope that perhaps it wasn't too late for Michael to discover who his mother really was. To develop the kind of relationship that had been missing from our lives for decades. I'm willing to try, Michael. But it has to be different this time. No discussions about business opportunities or financial assistance. No expectations that rebuilding our relationship will restore access to my money. If you want to know me as a person, you have to be prepared to value me for who I am rather than what I can provide. We spent the rest of the morning talking, with Sophia occasionally joining the conversation in ways that highlighted the difference between someone who knew me as a person and someone who was just beginning to learn. Michael asked questions he'd never thought to ask before, listened to stories he'd never made time to hear, and began to understand the woman who'd shaped his childhood in ways he'd never fully appreciated. When he left that afternoon, he hugged me with an intensity that reminded me of the little boy who used to run to greet me when I came home from work. It wasn't a solution to all the problems between us, but it was a beginning, the first authentic moment we'd shared in years. Over the following months, the pattern continued with Sarah and David as well. Each of them eventually found their way to my door, humbled by circumstances and ready to acknowledge that they'd lost something valuable through their own choices. The conversations were difficult, sometimes painful, but they were also honest in ways our family communications hadn't been for decades. Sarah's gallery dreams had indeed collapsed without my financial backing, forcing her to confront the reality that she'd been planning a business based on other people's money rather than her own vision and commitment. David's investment strategies had suffered without access to my capital, making him realize how much of his professional confidence had been built on family connections rather than genuine expertise. But more importantly, they'd all witnessed what I'd built with Sophia, the authentic relationship that had developed when money wasn't part of the equation. They could see the difference between purchased attention and genuine affection, between obligation and love. The foundation I'd established for abandoned elderly people was thriving, helping hundreds of individuals rebuild their lives and reconnect with family members who'd learned to value them again. The irony wasn't lost on me that my own family crisis had created an organization that was healing similar wounds for others. As I write this, 2 years have passed since that morning in the hotel lobby when I woke up to discover I'd been abandoned by the people I loved most. The woman who fell asleep in that chair no longer exists, replaced by someone who understands her own worth and insists on authentic love rather than transactional relationships. My children and I are rebuilding our connections slowly, carefully, with new understanding of what genuine family relationships require. Sophia is flourishing at university, living with me by choice rather than necessity, enriching my life in ways I never expected. The foundation continues to grow, helping other elderly individuals discover that they deserve better than being treated as burdens by their families. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept substitutes for real love. Sometimes walking away from people who take you for granted is the only way to teach them your true value. And sometimes the most expensive lesson you can give someone is showing them what life looks like when your generosity is no longer available to solve their problems. The wealth that Thomas and I built together is being used for purposes we would both be proud of, supporting people who genuinely need assistance rather than enabling the comfortable entitlement of people who'd learned to see money as a substitute for emotional effort. At 75, I'm finally living the life I should have chosen decades ago, surrounded by people who value my presence more than my presence, engaged in work that reflects my values rather than other people's expectations, free from the exhausting burden of managing relationships that were never really relationships at all. That hotel lobby was the setting for the most painful awakening of my life, but it was also the beginning of my liberation from expectations that had never served anyone well. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to demand what you deserve, even when the people you love most aren't capable of providing it. The lesson is simple but profound. True wealth isn't measured in dollars or possessions, but in relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. When you finally understand the difference, no amount of money feels worth accepting anything less. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.